Welcome back to the MemSQL Developer Livestream. Today we're going to focus on testing. Specifically, we're going to focus on unit testing the API, the Express API. We're going to see if we can get into integration testing, but that may need to wait until next week. We may also need to wait on unit and integration end-to-end testing inside the Vue app as well. So let's dive in. We're going to start with upgrading TypeScript in both places. So I upgraded TypeScript in the API. I upgraded TypeScript in the app. And what I noticed as I did that was that we actually accidentally committed the package lock JSON. So here's the package lock JSON that we committed. And all else being equal, the package lock JSON is great for in a corporate environment where we want to all keep the same dependencies. But in this environment where we want to upgrade to the latest every time, having the package lock JSON committed means that we can't do that. So let's get this out of Git. Now, one of the things is we have a git ignore here inside the app folder and a git ignore here inside the API folder. The git ignore here inside the API folder, we're inside the API folder right here. Here's this git ignore, and it's pretty empty. The git ignore inside the app folder is actually much more robust. So let's start with that. And we'll make one git ignore to rule them all. So the dist folder, let's also ignore package lock JSON. We've already got node modules here. Let's grab the .env file as well. In theory, we could have used .env.local, but we just used .env. So here's our git ignore file. Let's also ignore star.orig. Git sometimes leaves those behind when we do a merge. And now we've got that git ignore. In the API folder, we want to delete this git ignore file. And in the app folder, we want to move this one to the root. That's perfect. But we still have that package lock.json here. And it still says it has changes. Let's move it out of the way for a minute. We don't want to delete it. Now we have those git ignore files. Let's stage that one. Let's stage this one. Removing the old one. And here we're removing the package lock JSON. That's perfect. We don't want to add the one where we renamed it. We just want to remove that one. Okay. Now that we've got that removed, we'll rename it back into place, refresh. And now we see we have changes in package JSON. Here's changes updating the TypeScript version. And let's also update this to license MIT. That isn't strictly necessary because we do have the license file in the project and we have the license in, that's not where we want to put it. We do have the license inside the repository and inside the README, but putting it here is kind of a nice step as well. And let's stage those changes. That's great. Now let's talk about testing. First thing we need to do is let's install Jest and the Jest dependencies. I'm in the API folder. We'll install Jest, TS-Jest, that we can use it with TypeScript, and the Jest types. That's perfect. That'll take a minute to install. So while it's installing, let's open up package.json. And here in package.json, right now we say we're not doing any tests. Let's say Jest. That will be our testing suite. And hopefully it hasn't written those changes in package.json yet. But that is a race here. Let's take a look at the code that we need to test. Here's the product controller, the product route. We come in and we have 3 exit points here. One exit point if we have no product code specified, and one exit point if we didn't find a product in the database, and one exit point if we did find the product in the database. So I foresee that we'll need 3 tests to be able to test this. Let's create a new file. New file, product.spec.ts. Now we could create these inside of a test folder and that would work just fine as well, but let's start here. A test says it, and then we'll describe what it should do, should pass, and then we'll give it the function that it should run to execute that test. The test should pass. Here inside the test, we can say expect true to be true. Jasmine coined this mechanism, and Jest uses the Jasmine syntax. If we were to use Mocha and Chai to do this, it would look like that. That's not all that different, but we can use the Jest syntax in this case. How's that install looking? Still going? So part of what's really helpful as we're building tests is to be able to debug these tests as well. So a really cool post right here talks about how to debug Jest tests. And they have the code for how to create a debug inside launch.json. Right now in our launch.json, we have mechanisms for debugging the TypeScript. I'm going to change this to run because that's kind of like our production run. And now here, let's also add a new one for debugging our tests. In his post, he notes that we probably shouldn't include the config to Jest config JSON, but let's also say -- coverage equals false. If we have code coverage, that actually changes the line numbers, which makes debugging a little bit more painful. Okay, so we've got that ready to go. As this finishes, oh, we're still going. Then let's talk through some of the tests. We're not quite set up, but let's get started on some of the tests. We've got this test. We could set a breakpoint here, and it should run. Now with these tests, we can create groups, a describe block. So in this case, we'll say routes product. That's what we're going to test. And we just then create a method that encloses that. So we can have various tests inside this describe block, and all of those will be run as one suite. And so that's pretty cool. We now have this describe block. It has one test. Once it finishes installing, is it done? Nope. Then we'll be able to run that test. So we wanted to have 3 tests. Let's create these 3. It should return product when found in database. It should 404 when not found in database. Now we're going to want to mock the database here so that we're not actually, so that we don't have that dependency, and so that our tests will run a little bit faster. Integration tests will actually go the full route to the database. Should return the product when, should return 404 when no product code passed. Okay, so now we have, oh, did our install finish? It did. Very nice. So the next step in setting up this, we've done our install. We've added the entry into package JSON to tell it what npm test should do. And the next step is to instantiate, to initialize tsjest. So npx tsjest config init. That will get us this jest KS. And Jest config.js gives us some configuration details about how we want to run our tests. It'll use ts-jest, the test environment is node, and we can reach off into the oven to find more Jest settings if we would like. So for example, here I'm going to say, I would like to not run tests inside the dist directory and inside the node modules folder. Alternatively, I could adjust the test regex to, by default it says both JS and TS, and it'll also do JavaScript JSX and TSX. But either one of these will accomplish the same thing. We can collect code coverage, and where is that coverage coming from? Well, from anything inside the source directory that ends in .ts. So we won't grab coverage information on, that's kind of interesting. Let's pull out coverage for now, just because that'll slow us down a smidge. We won't grab coverage information for all of these JavaScript things like the JS config and other JavaScript resources, only for those TypeScript resources that will get built into our application. Now that we've got Jest ready to go, npm run test, and we can see all of our tests running. So in this case, we have that original test, the one that we just did the hello world, and then we have our three test scenario. So we can see that it's going to go run all of the things it discovered, product.spec.ts, and it's going to run the tests inside this suite. It looks like all 4 of them passed. That's excellent, except here in our product.spec.ts, we didn't actually test anything here. So as I'm kind of speccing out these tests, I'm going to throw an error that identifies for me that I haven't written this test. Now when I run the test, it's obvious that, oh, not that. npm run test. It's now obvious to me that I haven't written those tests. They aren't incorrectly green. We'll see 1 passed test and 3 failed tests. And what's really cool is it tells me exactly where it failed, the line number, all the details about that failure. That's perfect. The other thing we wanted to make sure that we can do is debug our tests. So we've got this breakpoint. Let's come into the debug panel, and we will switch our debug.js tests. We can change that name just a smidge. Let's just call this tests. Okay, in our debugger, we'll choose our test configuration and we'll push go. And now we're able to launch into the debugger for this application, much like we launched into the debugger as we were running, but now we are debugging our tests. There's times when there's a weird something that I can't just figure out quite right, and it's great to be able to step in, take a look at all the variables. That's perfect. Okay, we've got our 3 things. It should return a product when found in the database, when not found in the database, and when no product code is passed. So to start off, let's go. We probably want our step to be something like get product by product code. We'll pass in a request and a response, those 2 parameters into the method. It's an async method, so let's await it. That makes this an async method. Well, somehow we need to say const request equals make mock request. Const response equals make mock response. And now we'll want to assert some things. Expect, we'll want to check the status code to be, in this case, it should return a 200. Expect request.json to be product. And that's probably what we want our test to look like. the cool thing is these fall into 3 categories: arrange, act, assert. And so we'll see those 3 categories in all of our tests. Now we haven't built out make mock request or make mock response or product or all the things. So let's start out by taking a look at our code and getting a feel for how we'll test it. Here's our product.ts, and this is the piece that we want to test. Now right now, this method is baked into the router, and we really want to separate those 2 pieces apart because it would be difficult to reflect into the router to try and get this method and do all the things. So part of what that post really highlighted was that we want this to be an async function. We want this method to be separate. Let's pull this out and set it here. Now that this is separate, we can expose it. Let's say export async function, and we'll highlight that here, not for public consumption, exported for testing. And now what's interesting is we've lost some of that type safety of TypeScript. What is a request? What is a response? To that end, what is a DB? Let's call this a request. This is a response. And this is a connection. Okay, request. Thank you, VS Code. Request comes from the express module. That's perfect. So does response. And connection comes from the MySQL2/promise. Promise is the one that gives us the async details, which is really cool. And what this is highlighting is that, hey, it doesn't have a length. Well, it doesn't have a length because execute could return a row data packet array or a row data packet array or an OK packet, and OK packet doesn't have a length. We expect it to return this row data packet array. So we'll give it that. This one pulls in from the MySQL2 promise library, and now we're ready to go. Okay, so now that we've exported this get product by code here in our test, we can say import that from product. That's perfect. And I like to tag this as suite under test. Product. What is the product that we're going to create? Well, const product code is unit test. It doesn't matter. Const product equals, well, we've got the product code, and we know a product takes other things. But when we say as product, it just says, hey, I know what I'm doing. I'm going to cast it into the thing that makes sense. Import product from types product. Now we haven't created that yet. Let's go do that. Source, new folder, types, new file inside types is product.ts. Now the cool thing about product.ts is that we've defined it in our app, but we haven't defined it in our API yet. Ideally, we'd have something that would create a junction or some kind of mechanism that copies these things across. But for now, let's just duplicate it. Okay, so we've created this product. Now we need to make mock request. We're going to create a new folder called mocks, and we'll create a new file, mock request.ts. So what are we using here inside the product? We can close a few of these things now. What are we using inside this product in our request? Well, we have this request. We're looking at params.productcode, app.locals.db. Okay, we may want to change the product code throughout our test. So let's do that. Let's say export function make mock request. Now you're going to pass in the database object. That is a connection. And you'll probably pass in things that I want to stick on this request. Like params, we may later use query string. Our other piece does this. So I'm going to reach into the oven only because this was really weird to figure out. Mock request. We want to take in a params and query of all the things. Okay. Finding that params was really hard. We've got our imports. And now let's return this object as request. And we can even say we're going to return a request. Now, as request says, don't validate the thing, just believe you've got it. Params could be the params. And let's make this optional. And the query optional. Oh, they are optional right here. The params is optional. The query is optional. So params or an empty object. Query is query or an empty object. And then locals DB. Did we rig that correctly? So we'll do request.params.productcode and request.app.locals.db. Ooh, request.app.locals.db. I missed that one. App locals db. There we go. So now we've got our mock request. That's perfect. Let's create our mock response. New file, mock response.ts. Now here in the mock response, export function make mock response. We're not going to put anything in because we're not initializing it with anything, but we do need to do a whole lot of things. Const response equals an object, return response as response. Thank you, VS Code. Now here in our product, we call a couple of methods. We call status, end, we call JSON. So let's go build out those methods. Res.status equals function, or we can just go like this. Status, it will take in a number, and it will return our response. Let's actually say this is as response right there. Perfect. But it may be helpful for us to keep track of what status they picked. That might be a thing that we'll want to keep track of. So let's invent this state thing. And we'll just capture the values that they put together. So it's no longer a response. Let's say export type mock response is a response, and it's also this status object. And this status object could have a status. Let's default it to undefined. Number or undefined. Undefined will mean we didn't set it. Like when we did .json, we didn't set it to 200. We could default this to 200, but I find that it's too easy at that point to accidentally not set it. And let's grab the JSON data that they put in. Now this is an unknown or undefined if they haven't set it. So let's say status is, state has a status, and it has a JSON. And we'll set them to undefined in both cases so that we don't have to worry about it. Now, it would be nice to not have this be unknown. Let's have it be a type of T result. Well, what is T result? We can create this as a generic to say whatever type we pass in, that will be what this is. So mock response, let's say you can pick the type of the result. And now this is a mock response of that T result. That's pretty cool. Maybe a mistake because neither type sufficiently overlaps. I think I got something wrong in that. Let's go look at this. Did I get it wrong? Or did I code this wrong? Yeah, that might be a better way to say it. Rather than saying or undefined, let's say it's optional. So at that point, we can just say, yep, I haven't specified the state yet. That's pretty cool. So status sets the status. JSON takes the JSON, which we will assume is a type of T result. So JSON will set to JSON. And then the end method. And the end method actually returns void. So end will take in nothing, and it will return nothing. Perfect. We've built out that mock response. So this returns a mock response of type whatever JSON you expect, but the JSON may still be blank. That's cool. Back here in our test, now we've got a make mock response and make mock request. Let's pull those in. Thank you, VS Code. I'm going to reference it as a relative path instead of an absolute path, but either way works. Now make mock request is going to take in a DB and DB and this thing params will say is this product code. That's what we want to bake into the params. And then mock response, we expect it to be of type product. Cool. Now, when we're doing our assertions, it's not request.status, but rather request.state.status and request.state.json. Now that's where this response is really interesting because it's a mock response of type product. So now we have that state to go into. Did I name it badly? State, yes, cool. So we don't have our DB yet. Let's build that. Const DB equals make mock DB. Now we will want to tell it what we want to return from the database. So in this case, what we want to return is this array of product. And so this will be a mock DB of product array. That's pretty cool. Let's go make a mock database. New file, mock db.ts. Okay. Export function make mock db, and this will take in a results of type T result, and it will return a connection. Well, T result, we also want to say this is of type T result, That's cool. Here in our connection, const db equals something. And now we'll say as connection. Thank you, VS Code. I would like to import this from MySQL 2/promise. So we use two methods. In the product class, we're using the execute method. And in the products class, we're using the query method. So db.query equals query, and db.execute equals query. They're the same method, more or less. Function query will take in some SQL that is a string, and it will take in some values, which is an unknown array. Now, there's times when we may not actually pass in values, so we can make that optional. And we need to return this array that has the results and the fields. Now, in this case, we're not using the fields for anything, so that's fine. Okay, now it would be helpful to capture these two values if we need them. So let's do that same trick of saying state, and we'll create a new type. Export type mock connection, and we know what type of thing we'll return. So let's say of type T result equals connection and this state thing. This state thing could have a SQL, which is a string, and it could have values, which is an unknown array. Now, there's other ways to call it. You could pass in an object, but in our case, that's good. And so now, instead of, oh, that's not the delete button. Instead of returning a connection, let's return a mock connection of type T result, because we know what type of result it is. That's cool. So there's that mock connection of type T result. State isn't set yet. And here inside the query, let's capture that. State db.state.sql equals SQL, db.state.values equals values. Now, if we call this query more than once, yes, we're going to overwrite them, and that's where it might be helpful to use a library like Signon that is able to make more specific and durable mocks, but this gets it done for us. Now, we haven't done all of the exact details just so I'm going to cheat. TS ignore. I just want you to do it. In a future video, we may come back and put in all of the types just so, but I think we're good for now. So we've got the mock database. We need to pass in our mock database into our request builder. And now let's give this test a try and see if we're able to validate that our code works as expected. Now, because we've mocked the database, we're not actually hitting the results, but stale, not state. We're not actually hitting the database, which is pretty perfect. This is a result of type mock response product. Now, does it have those two types? Oh, we're testing request. It's not actually a request, it's response. Response. Okay. Now this type declaration is likely not necessary anymore. Okay, let's rerun that test. npm run test. We're still going to get failures for the two tests that we haven't written yet, and we can probably remove that hello world test now. But let's see if the test we just wrote passed. Ooh. I did not fix up this. npm run tests. We've got our test ready to go. 1 failed and 3 failed. So there's the 2 that should fail. Ooh, we expected it to be 200, but it wasn't set. Here in our code, product.ts, when we return the results, we don't actually say .status 200. We just take it for granted that that was set. So 2 things: we could either construct our mock response to assume that it's 200, or just not validate the status. If we've got status, that means it failed. So let's comment this and say we've got it not set. Okay. So we've got this test, npm run test, and let's see it succeed. Yeah, there we go. 1 pass test. That's cool. So we've got our test to return the product when found in the database. Let's create the test when it's not found in the database. A lot of what we've got is the same. We're still passing in a product code, but now the result, what we want to return, is an empty array. So that's what the database will return. And now what we want to validate is that this is a 404 and that the JSON is undefined. Now technically we could say this is undefined, and that might be a little bit more descriptive, just to say, hey, we expect it to be blank. I like that. Await. Oh, async, not await. So now we've got our next test. Let's do the third test. So this should return a 404 when no product code is passed. So now we're going to say, I don't want to send in a params. I'm just going to give it an empty object. Now it'll pick out the product code. This is blank product code. Now we're never going to do the database call, but passing in an empty array can't hurt. And now we expect this to be a 404, and we expect this to be undefined. So let's fire it up. npm run test. Does take a little bit to transfer the things. That is great. We've got the tests and all of them are good. Now, one of the things that is interesting here is that this test, if we say, no, I don't want to return anything, will actually highlight an error in our code. Now, there's an error right here. res.status is 404 and .end, but then we still fall through and we try to get the content and away it goes. So our test actually isn't highlighting that. Our test didn't actually flex that path. It fell through, it didn't get it out of the database, and away it goes. So at this point, we might want to say, expect db.sql to be undefined. And here's how we can validate that that worked. db.state.sql. So now we want to say it didn't get called. If we wanted to, we could create another property inside our mock object saying it got called. So we're kind of misusing the SQL property for that. But now let's run our test. TypeScript compiles. Two passed and one failed. It wasn't undefined. It actually did call the database. So let's go take a look at that. Because it fell through here, it actually called the database and returned not found. So what we found in our test is we actually need to return there. That's cool. Let's fire up our tests again. We've got 3 passing tests. That was really cool. So you saw that we created mock. Let's go back to our test. We created a mock database so that we weren't actually running code against a real database. We were just doing this in-memory thing, which happened really fast. We created this mock request that filled in all the details that we were going to use. We created this mock response that also filled in all the details that we were going to use. And then we saved off the state that we needed to be able to use those in really interesting ways. Now next week, we're going to do similar things. Let's take the mock objects that we built and we'll test the products controller, also separating out the controller method from the way it's called. And we'll also dig into integration tests in the API and take a look at how we can do an end-to-end test that starts at the beginning, at the front end, and goes all the way through to the database and back. So join us next week for the MemSQL Developer Livestream, where we dig into more unit testing and integration testing with Jest and TypeScript. See you then.